Hey class, so we'll start off where we left off last class, which is on chapter 2. This is talking about the market mechanism and when we can use the supply-demand model. So we're assuming that at any given price, a quantity will be produced and sold. So, in class I use the example of the bagel store, right? What's the amount of bagels that they have to stock in order to sell out, right around the time of the business closing. If they sell out too early, they didn't make enough. If they have way too many extra at the end of the day, they're going to lose money because they made too much inventory. Again, too little inventory, they end up leaving money on the table. The assumption makes sense only if the market is roughly competitive. Um, by this, we mean that both sellers and buyers have little market power, meaning they don't have monopoly power. Next, new equilibrium following a shift in supply. So, if supply hits the market, right? So, let me try to think of a good example here about a supply hitting the market. Well, we can use cryptocurrency, right? 5 to 7 years ago, there was really just Bitcoin, and it was, priced high. And as all these new cryptocurrencies came on, that shifted the supply curve to the right? There's way more options. So, demand being equal, with more supply in cryptocurrencies, and with demand, not changing, meaning new people aren't interested, what happens to the price of cryptocurrency? It drops, right? Because of that shift in the supply curve, way too much supply. New equilibrium following a shift in demand curve. Remember, for the most part, to get a shift in demand curve, we need higher levels of aggregate income in the economy, right? So for the demand for filet mignons and lobster tails to increase, we really need to have people making more money. Alternatively, you could see other shifts in the demand curve. For example, one that's kind of would be considered an inferior good, a topic we'll touch base on later, is if people made less money, we'd see the demand curve for McDonald's shift to the right because we want more McDonald's the less money we make. New equilibrium following shifts in supply and demand. So we can see shifts in supply and demand happen at the same time. So one thing, leaning on cryptocurrency again as an example, we had a greater supply of people of cryptocurrency on the market, and then a lot of people got discouraged because prices went down. So we saw demand go down at the same time supply was increasing, right? If demand decreases and supply increases at the same time, what you'll see is prices plummet. This may happen in the future with the auto market, right? Right now, prices are high, demand is high, supply is tight. But, in the next 2 years, with a loosening of the job market, you could see the demand for cars to drop because people are doing less well financially at the same time that supplies are high. Because these car companies, they try to build inventories and predict inventories years in advance. If you get an increase in supply but an increase in demand, it's hard to determine which one will outrun the other. Meaning, if the increase in demand is higher than the increase in supply, prices might still go up. But if increases in supply are higher than increases in demand, you might still see prices go down a little. So when both demand and supply increase at the same time, it's actually hard to determine, what will happen with the price. This is just revisiting the price of eggs in college education. The price of eggs on a real basis are cheaper than they were, 50 years ago. This is because, we've gotten more efficient with production effectively. On the opposite end, college is more expensive, than it was, 50 years ago. But another thing to consider is, like how has college changed in the last 50 years? There's definitely more technology being used in college, and I would say a classroom experience today is better than one 30 years ago. I mean, just think of having your professor being able to show a video of an expert in class. 30 years ago, you'd need to have the right VHS tape. Today, you just need the internet. So, is the cost justified? Well, it's up for debate. But I think if you look out over the next 20 or 30 years, you'll actually see the cost of education start to go lower because of all the advancements in technology. Market basket for eggs. The supply curve for eggs shifted downward as production costs fell. and the demand curve shifted to the left as consumers' preferences changed. So, this is an example of, increasing supply and decreasing demand brought prices lower, right? You know, Maybe you're less likely to have eggs for breakfast because compared to 50 years ago, you have so many options for breakfast, whether it's like overnight oats or a bowl of cereal, right? There's so many different options. Market for college education, the supply curve for college education shifted up as the cost of equipment, maintenance, and staffing rose. The demand curve shifted to the right as growing number of high school graduates desired a college education. Wage inequality in the U.S. Over the past two decades, the wages of skilled high-income workers has grown substantially, while the wages of unskilled low-income workers have fallen. Um, so, between 1978 and 2009, people in the top 20% of income distribution experienced an increase in their average real income of about 45%, while the unskilled workers saw a lower increase. Well, think about it from a supply and demand perspective. High skilled workers, there's less of supply, and we're in a world where technology workers are still in high demand. So no surprise that their wages increased at a faster pace of inflation. If you're a low skilled worker, let's just say you're working as a greeter in Walmart, right? Like you can't command or demand a high salary, and your skills, like you could do a similar job with no skills anywhere else. So no surprise that their wage rate falls. Um, this is about natural resources, consumption of copper. Copper is economic terms. It's nicknamed Dr. Copper because if prices on copper are rising, it's considered good for the health of the global economy. If we see prices of copper weakening, that means there's usually bad news in the global economy. This is because copper is an industrial metal that's used when we're building stuff. The amount of copper that's used in the wiring in homes or the building of electric cars is tremendous. I will say that, from a positioning standpoint, I'm actually bullish on copper. One of the reasons is the electrification of cars and everything else. And an electric car requires 4 times the copper of a regular car. Long run movements and supply and demand. One thing about copper, and you let's say you expect demand. Supplies of copper seem tight right now. Demand is okay, right? But if there's a pop in demand, it takes years to increase the supply of copper. Because what do you need to do? You need to find and build a new copper mine, which can take 1 to 5 years. This is why when you see copper pop in price, it's because demand increases quickly, but supplies are slow to take online. And this is talking about the demand for office space after 9/11. There's a lot of synergies between 9/11 and COVID in terms of what it's done to office space. Although I'll say that COVID had a greater impact because it just didn't impact New York City; it impacted almost all Tier 1 metropolitan cities. Alternatively, what you've seen in this environment is that it's probably increased the office space prices in like your local town square, but decreased the office prices, in big urban Tier 1 cities. And that chart was just displaying something really interesting, right? Again, after 9/11, the demand for office space in New York dropped and supply remained unchanged, right? While supply, unfortunately, like actually shrunk, right? Because buildings went down. So you had supply shrink, and then you also had demand drop. But the demand drop was way higher than the shrink in supply. Elasticity is a very important concept. I'll have you guys do a paper on this. Um, I might adjust the deadline as well, so I'll just double check that after I'm done recording this. But elasticity is the price change in one variable from a 1% increase in another. So, you're measuring elasticities of a product is pretty interesting. The formula below here, you should definitely memorize. So, change in quantity demanded over change in price as a percentage. If something is elastic, that number will equal 1 or higher. If it's inelastic, it will be below 1. So you think about that. If there's, what does a elasticity of 2 look like? Well, if prices drop by 50% and sales double, you have a very elastic good, right? But if prices drop by 50% and demand is unchanged, then you're dealing with an inelastic good. So think about gasoline as an inelastic good. If prices dropped on gasoline, are you driving more, using more gas? Probably not. If gas prices doubled, are you going to materially drive less? And the answer is probably not. Now, there's a breaking point, right, where like if gas was a nickel a gallon, you'll like store it in boxes, right, or tanks because it's so cheap. And if gas was $10 a gallon, you will change your driving habits. But on the margins, it's inelastic. Linear demand curve. So this is a good example of like what we would say about the hot dogs in class at the baseball stadium. So you pay a high price for that first hot dog, but by the time you get to that fourth hot dog, they have to pay you to eat it, right? Because your demand for hot dogs has been reduced. You could say the same thing about cars. Your family has one nice car, but by the time you buy your third car for the household, what are you buying? A junk box, right? Infinitely elastic demand. So with infinitely elastic demand, you really, everyone's selling potatoes for $1 and you sell them for 95 cents. You'll immediately sell out. Everyone's going to buy yours to take advantage of the arbitrage opportunity because they know they can get $1 for it somewhere else. Now, that also works if the market price for a potato is $1 and you sell it for $1.05, you sell no potatoes. And that's what infinitely elastic demand looks like. Completely inelastic demand. We could use gasoline. There's no perfect example, but with gasoline, if prices change, your demand doesn't change, and that's an example of a perfectly inelastic good. Now we know in practice that even with gasoline, there's some elasticity because you eventually change your driving habits or your carpool with people. There's other demand elasticities, so you could do income elasticity demand. You could say for a 5% change in your salary, how much of a demand change do you have for filet mignon and lobster tails? Or, what is your demand for vacation change with a 5% increase in salaries? So, as you can imagine, the elasticity of filet mignons and lobster tails are highly income elastic. So if you're making a lot more money, you're going to spend more money on food. But if times get tough, it's the first thing you cut out. There's also cross elasticity of demand. Percent change in quantity demanded of one good resulting from a 1% increase in the price of another. So, you can use hamburgers and hamburger buns. If we increase hamburger meat by 1%, how does that impact the demand for hamburger buns? And I'm sure they go down. Now, do they go down at the same rate? Maybe, probably not, because hamburger buns have alternative uses, right? You use them for a breakfast sandwich or chicken parm, right? But if hamburger prices go up, and then demand for hamburger drops, I would expect to see some drop in the price or demand of buns. Point versus arc elasticity. Price elasticity at one point on the demand curve versus another. So this is the concept that really directly relates to what I was talking about with gasoline. With gasoline markets, we know it's inelastic. Up until a certain point, gas is $10 a gallon. It's going to be elastic. It's going to be more elastic at 10 than it was at 5, right? Because you'll actually start changing your driving habits. This is talking about the market for wheat. This is just a visual example of how the prices will change the demand for wheat. When we think about elasticity, we talked about this last class, but elasticity is directly related to the substitutability of the product. And if wheat prices get too high, what do? You're going to buy some other product in order to satisfy the need for grain. You can buy quinoa instead of wheat. This is just another example of the calculation for the elasticity of wheat shown here. It's at 0.35 negative. So, that's showing that the elasticity, or wheat is fairly inelastic, meaning, even if price and change or change in price of wheat, we're not going to see a huge shift in demand. Although, everything shows some degree of elasticity. And then here we're showing another price elasticity below the 4 divided by 2480. And we see that at different prices, it's more or less inelastic. I would say eggs are also fairly inelastic, right? Because there's not a lot of substitutes for eggs. Even if we saw like last year, egg prices doubled, but the demand for eggs didn't change that much because eggs on the margins are still a very inexpensive food. This is just talking about the impact of weather on elasticity, right, and how that will change. Price of wheat in the U.S. This, not too relevant. This is just showing how the price of wheat fluctuates over time with demand and weather. Weather being a change in supply, and demand, just being driven by mostly population growth and eating habits. We've already talked a lot about this, but in the short run, gasoline is very inelastic, while in the long run, gasoline will be elastic because you'll have, when you own a car, you can't decide if you want to use gas or electricity. You're just using what you use. But eventually, you get the choice to swap to an electric car, right? And that will shift the demand for gasoline. Another cross elasticity talk here as well. We talked in class about like, hey, if we have more electric cars, what does that do to the demand for Snapple? And Snapple probably demand drops because you're going inside a gas station less. Demand and durability. So automobiles, short run and long run. The opposite is true from automobile demand. If price increases, consumers initially defer buying new cars. I've also experienced that as well. My lease ran up in the middle of the pandemic. New prices were much higher, so I deferred the purchase. Some of you guys might do that with an iPhone, right? You want the new iPhone, but do you really want to or have the money to spend? So you defer the purchase and you wait 6 months to get the iPhone, not when it's brand new. In the long run, however, old cars wear out and must be replaced. Thus, annual quantity demand picks up. Demand, therefore, is less elastic in the long run than it is in the short run for autos. Because you can always, on the short term, defer an auto, but in the long term, you'll need one. Income elasticities, we've talked a little bit about this. Income elasticities differ from short to long run. For most goods and services, food, beverage, entertainment, and so on, the income elasticity of demand is larger in the long run than the short run. For durable goods, the opposite is true. So we just talked about that in the last slide. Cyclical industries, so the sale of Ferraris or boats or high ticket items are considered cyclical, meaning when things are good, you buy more, and when things tighten up, you buy less. Um, this is talking about GDP. When GDP is higher, we'll generally see higher investments in durable goods because higher GDP indicates what? A growing economy. Annual growth rates are compared for GDP, consumer expenditures on durable goods. Durable goods are anything you can touch and feel for the most part. Cars, appliances, furniture, and consumer expenditures on service, food, and clothing. Because the stock of durable goods is large compared with annual demand, short-run income elasticity or short-term demand elasticities are larger than long-run elasticities. Like capital equipment, industries that produce durables are cyclical. That the changes are therefore magnified by GDP. Meaning, like when you're doing well, you buy the car. When you're doing poorly, you won't. But when you're doing poorly, you'll still buy, food, right? Demand for gasoline, based on price and income, right, and the number of years allowed to pass following for a price or income change. So we're seeing here that the demand for gasoline is fairly inelastic um, on the price level, but on the income level, the demand for autos is very elastic, right, especially after 3 to 5 years. Copper and short run and long run supply. We already touched base on this with an example I used earlier. So, in the short run, it's very difficult to change the supply of copper, but demand can change quickly based on how hot or cool an economy gets. And these are short run and long run supply curves. In the long run, we can dramatically increase supply. In the short run, we can do almost nothing to change the supply. This is why demand changes for copper change prices quickly, and it's also why copper is so volatile. Another impact on supply, weather, right? So this is talking about how the weather, Brazil is a huge supplier of coffee, and negative changes in their weather from year to year will have a great impact on price. So if one thing that's going on right now is they say that we're entering an El Nino storm season for the next few years. which means like the waters are hotter and we're more likely to get hurricanes. That could potentially disrupt agriculture, and if that comes to pass, agriculture prices rise for the next few years. Why? Because we've had supply cut off because of global storm surges. And this is just an example of supply and demand for coffee. One thing I'll say about coffee is that demand is fairly inelastic because of the addictive nature of caffeine. There are more substitutes for coffee now than there were 10, 20 years ago when you think about energy drinks and things like that. Eventually, right, coffee gets too expensive, you switch to Red Bull because then Red Bull becomes the cheap option. Not saying that's a good idea, but that's just how you would think about it. Fitting linear supply and demand curves into data. So given data for the equilibrium price, and remember, equilibrium price is a market clearing price, as well as estimates for elasticity of demand and supply, we can calculate the parameters C and D for the supply curve A and B for the demand curve. And the curves can then be used to analyze the behavior of market quantitatively. So, like Apple's coming out with an iPhone today, announcing it. I think it's probably going to be $100 more expensive than the one last year. Apple's probably done all these studies that say, hey, we can increase prices by $100 and we'll still sell the same amount of phones. Why? Because within this certain price range of $1,000 to $1,200, demand is inelastic. But if Apple releases a $2,000 phone, they know that demand will fall for that typically. Understanding and predicting the effects of changing market conditions. So our goal is to find values of the constants A, B, C, and D in the supply and demand equations based on the known values ES, ED, P, and Q. So based on quantity, demand, and price, can we figure out the supply and demand curve? And you can see that with your own eyes as prices increase. You go to a restaurant, you're like, I like filet mignon, but I thought it'd be $40, not 70, so I'll have the carbonara instead for 25. Right? You're making the active decision to alter your demand because of changes in prices. Again, more about the behavior of copper prices, which we talked about already, but they're very volatile, and that is really driven by tight supply in the short run and swift changes in demand. Copper prices are shown in both nominal, not adjusted for inflation, and real inflation-adjusted terms. In real terms, copper prices declined from the early 70s to the mid 80s as demand fell. And then from 88 to 90, the copper price rose in response to supply disruptions caused by strikes in Peru, but fell after the strike ended, and then prices declined during 96 to 2002, and then increased into the housing bubble. Remember how much copper I said is used in housing and cars, especially electric cars. The shift in the demand curve corresponded to a 20% decline in demand, leads to a 10% change in price. Since the early 70s, the world's oil market has been buffeted by OPEC, although that's changed in the last 10 years because the U.S. has become a major oil producer and exporter. About 15 years ago, the U.S. was in the top 50 for oil production. Right now it's arguably in the top 3, depending on which statistics you use. So, that being said, OPEC does not have as much control over the oil market as they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. This is talking about upheaval in the world oil market. So between 2009 and 2011, we had a global economic crisis. All the prices mentioned in 2001, $2011. Prices $80 a barrel between 2009 and 2011. World demand and supply total was 32 billion barrels. OPEC supply was 13, so roughly half. And then non-OPEC was around 19 billion barrels. So again, showing here, demand again for oil, and world demand in the short run is very inelastic. And this is showing the impact of a Saudi production cut. The one thing I would say that's changed in the last 5 years since probably the production of these charts is that effectively the change in the oil market is that if Saudis cut production, the U.S. will fill in the gaps, which makes their production cuts less valuable here. Effects of price controls. So without price controls, the market clears at equilibrium quantity P and Q0. But if we regulate the price to be no higher, then the quantity supplied falls. So the example I'd use here is rent control. Like if I'm a landlord and I can only charge a maximum of $2,000 a month, what that will do is it will stop people from investing in building apartments. Why? Because they know they can only make a certain amount of money. Their money they can make is capped. If you can only make $2,000 a month on the rent because there's rent control, you might not fix up the apartment as appropriate. Why? Because you're not financially incented to like make it nicer because you can't charge more rent anyway. So why make it nicer? Price of natural gas, similar to copper, very volatile. Price controls and natural gas shortages. So it's a natural gas shortage. The government might try to implement a price control. The reason this is generally a bad idea is because if you have a price control on natural gas, that will stop new gas drillers from wanting to explore for new gas because they might be like, hey, if the price I can make off the gas is capped, then why would I, look for anything new? I'd rather invest in biotech stocks, if I want a high return. There's also examples about this, like with bottled water in disaster zones, right? Like you might want bottled water in a disaster zone, and like scalpers might try to sell water in the disaster zone, and the government might outlaw that, say, hey, we won't allow people to be ripped off. But the problem is less people will bring water than otherwise if they don't allow scalping. So it's not a good answer, but people are driven by financial incentives. And if there's a disaster zone and you want water, you might be willing to pay $5 for it. And if they set a price cap of 2 and the government doesn't provide the water, then other sellers aren't going to waste their time driving the disaster zone with water because they're not going to be fairly compensated for it. And that's the end of this chapter, guys. I will see you on Thursday.